Good evening, everybody. My name is Willeke Wendrich and I'm the director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. Tonight is the first version of a new lecture series, the Author Spotlight, which highlights the work of authors of books that we publish at the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology Press. And the person who will introduce our first author is the Director of Publications, Randy Danforth. Randy has a BA in Archaeology from Yale, then spent about 2 decades working mostly in different journals, and finally went to Cairo and worked for the American University in Cairo Press. And that's where we actually met when I was also living in Cairo. She did some freelance work on books, and in 2013 we were happy enough to have her here at the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology to do our book series, which is really at the core of what we do as a research institute. So I welcome Randy, who will introduce our speaker of tonight.
Thank you very much, Willeke, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for joining us for our very first Cotsen Institute of Archaeology Press Author Spotlight Talk, featuring our very own UCLA Anthropology professor and Cotsen affiliate, Richard Lesure. The concept for this series was encouraged by Aaron Burke, who is our CIOA Press editor-in-chief on the editorial board, to shine a bright spotlight on our great authors to both promote their books and their work. It's very appropriate to kick this off with Richard, who is professor of anthropology and Marilyn Beaudry Corbett Endowed Chair in Mesoamerican Archaeology. And his book that you'll hear about tonight, Paso de la Amada, is the first book bearing the imprint of the Mesoamerican publication series endowed by the late Marilyn Beaudry Corbett. Richard Lesure attained his PhD at the University of Michigan, and just about as soon as he did, UCLA snapped him up. He's been teaching here since 1995, and he studies the social transformations associated with the appearance of settled village life in ancient Mesoamerica during the formative period, working on the coast of Chiapas, Mexico, on the Pacific coast, and in Tlaxcala in the central highlands of Mexico. He'll pronounce that better than I did, I'm sure, about 2 hours from Mexico City. He has a special interest in modeled ceramic imagery, including figurines, and the next book will be on a remarkable collection from Paso de la Amada and other early sites in the Soconusco region of coastal Chiapas. Welcome, Professor Lesure.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Willeke, Michelle, and Aaron for inviting me to this. Feels crazy dangerous to take off the mask. Haven't done that in a long time. So thanks again for inviting me and to talk about the product of 30 years of work that I've been doing. I hope that I never end up publishing another book that weighs over 6 pounds. Very much hope the next one won't. And I want to thank in advance all the colleagues and collaborators and participants that have worked on this project over many years. I'll mention some, but I can't mention anyone, and I've probably forgotten key people as well. I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about ancient Mesoamerica and orienting us in space and time. Mesoamerica was a tradition that developed over the course of hundreds of years in Middle America. It extended at the time of the conquest around the boundaries that you see here. It incorporated people speaking a whole variety of languages, 4 language families, so as different from each other as English and Chinese all together, but over the course of centuries of contact, they came to share a whole variety of traditions. We are going to be focusing on the site of Paso de la Amada, which is on the Pacific coast of the modern state of Chiapas, Mexico. I'll be talking about that throughout the talk. Where we're located in time is in the formative period. This is the sequence from the beginning of the Holocene to the Spanish conquest in Mesoamerica. The formative period is significant in a bunch of different ways. It's about 2,000 years long and begins at the time that nomadic hunter-gatherer food producers settle in villages for the first time, and it ends with fully developed, mature urban states. So a lot socially happens at that time. We're going to be focused on the very, very beginning of this era, 1900 to about 1300 BC in one particular site there on the Pacific coast. So the transition to the formative involved the appearance of pottery, well-fired ceramic containers, and settled village life that happened around the same time, around 1900 BC, in a bunch of different places in Mesoamerica. We are going to be looking in, as I said, at just one of those. I won't get to talk about the rest. So when this research was conceived in the late 1980s, very early 1990s, there were two kind of aspects that I was drawing on in the research. One was the image of the early Mesoamerican village that was formed by research in highland Mesoamerica, where archaeologists had found the traces of relatively small perishable houses, kind of 8 meters long, 4 or 5 meters wide, that would have housed a single nuclear family and were surrounded by features by pits, sometimes burials, hearths, and so forth. So we had a model of the early Mesoamerican village composed of these small nuclear family residences and all autonomous, scattered across a landscape. And we were interested at that time in the 1980s in the origins of social inequality in villages like that, in these early villages. And archaeologists came up with this sort of set of approaches to study the emergence of inequality in villages. The idea would be that elite households would serve more food, they would be more involved in interregional exchange, so they're higher, non-elite houses lower. The production of labor-intensive craft products would be higher there, and they would be particularly focused on ritual and control sacred knowledge and so forth. And so the idea was, in terms of archaeological visibility of the emergence of inequality, we would expect elite houses to be doing more of those things and non-elite houses less of them. These are, I'm not going to talk about these because of time, but these are the specific kinds of artifacts that we looked at. We planned to look at, and we did indeed look at. The theories of the time about the emergence of inequality not only posited these as the way to find evidence of early elites in the archaeological record. The idea was that by households engaging differentially in these activities, that itself would lead to the emergence of inequality. It still remains a super interesting model, but spoiler alert, it's not going to work in this case here, even though standard archaeological kind of stuff. Okay, and I'll talk about a little bit why at the end. So I got involved in this work at Paso de la Amada through the influence of the project directors in the Mazatán Early Formative Project, John Clark of Brigham Young University and Michael Blake of the University of British Columbia. And they had already started working in this Soconusco region, which is a narrow strip of the Pacific coast between the Pacific Ocean and the Sierra Madre Mountains in coastal Chiapas. It's sort of 20 kilometers or so from the coast to the Piedmont of the mountains, and there are lots of wetlands that have been. A lot of it drained now for agriculture, so there was more in the past, but there's significant swamps and estuaries, and the people in early villages there were using the resources of those quite a lot. There's lots to be said about this region and its early settlement. John and Mike knew that there was evidence of very early ceramics, some of the earliest in Mesoamerica, and villages that were quite accessible to excavation in these early deposits, including particularly Paso de la Amada. And they did a first season in 1985 where Mike Blake discovered this surprisingly large building. So it's 17.5 meters long, 9, I think, meters wide. And, you know, all this is a trace of a hard-packed and partially burnt floor with post holes that mark where originally posts were. It was dismantled and another structure built on top of it and thus preserved by a layer of fill. But surprisingly large building compared to our expectations for early Mesoamerican villages. Not quite sure how this thing works. It seems to come out from the side here. And Blake proposed that it was the residence of an elite, of the chief, perhaps, of the village. It turns out it's in the one of the two largest mounds at the site. So they invited me to join their field crew, and I want to thank John and Mike for inviting me down, and also the New World Archaeological Foundation of Brigham Young University, which has hosted us and our artifacts down there for all of these decades, and John Clark, who's this very tall guy in the back here. He was the director of the foundation for many years, and this is Michael Blake, whose work I'm going to be talking about extensively. And this guy is me late in the last millennium there. It's a very long time ago. So they brought me down in 1990 as a graduate student, and I participated in a very exciting excavation. So Blake's idea for this season was to dig below that floor that he'd found previously. They had dug a test pit down and found that there was more floors down below, except that the next floor was separated by a pretty thick layer of fill on top of some previous floor. And so we had to dig through the fill. So we were, gradually digging through the fill, and we saw lines appearing in the fill that shouldn't be there. And this turned out to, as we gradually kept excavating and clarified, to be low clay walls or benches that defined the shape of a dumbbell-shaped structure. This was 22 meters long and I think 11 meters wide. There's the director there, Mike Blake, taking a look. And lots of post holes, dirty floor in the sense of chemical traces of habitation and micro artifacts of all sorts of the full range of artifacts that people would use in domestic residences, but huge, right? Really, really much bigger than you would expect for the early Mesoamerican village. And it's built on a meter-high platform. It has these two lateral porches and then a lower step. So just the platform itself includes significant fill, but it was also the foundation for a perishable structure that just to roof it would have been huge. This is a gas station that they were building nearby in one of our field seasons, 1992, I think, that is similar in size. And you can imagine how many palm trees it would take to put a thatch roof on that thing. So not only was the floor dirty in the sense it looked inhabited, there was also domestic refuse in pits out to the back and sides. It's a little complicated in terms of there's temporal issues and everything, but it really seems like this is the remains of a residence, a rather spectacular, very large residence, and it contrasted with the relatively few cases we have of smaller houses. This is, sort of 10 meters or so long, so less than half the length, much smaller in area. The smaller residences tended to not get covered over by large layers of fill, And so they're much harder to find, as I found out. I was in charge of finding them, but we did find a few to contrast with that series at Mound 6 is this mound, that the large mound that Michael Blake was excavating. He came back in 1993 and excavated below that floor you looked at before and found this trace here of a previous building directly beneath the later one. It wasn't quite as long, so when they dismantled and covered over that earlier one, they lengthened the building a bit, but they followed identically the edges, and there was even, this is so bizarre, there was even this little tiny wall or something just that tall that was precisely under the line of the later wall, which they've left I should mention, these that they left here are the later walls left intact, so you can see what they found below. But this right here appeared in the lower structure. So basically what you have is a whole series of buildings over time preserving alignment and orientation. They clearly have memory traces of the prior building, and there's all this evidence of people having lived there. Big debate over whether indeed people lived there or whether these were temples or what have you. We believe that people lived there. So the proposal of Blake and Clark was that this is a sequence of elite residences, probably the guy in charge at Paso de la Amada. Over a long series of time, the family maintained a connection. It really looks like we have not just inequality, but hereditary inequality, that whoever was living there was able to pass on their status to their offspring. So this is where I finally come in here, is that I was assigned the task of going and digging other mounds to see if we could find other structures, other residences, which I didn't have that much luck at, but also to find the artifacts associated with them and to try to apply this model of the emergence of inequality to this case, seeing if we could see higher engagement in serving of food, interregional exchange, production of labor-intensive crafts, and ritual and control of sacred knowledge at Mound 6, that large building that Blake was excavating, compared to other contemporaneous residences, and also to fill out the occupation of the site through time. So that was my assignment, and I got a kind of crazy number of grants, probably more than I needed, so I excavated a lot. I'd like to mention my collaborator in several of these field seasons was Tomas Perez Suarez of the National University, National Autonomous University of Mexico, who was a wonderful field companion and also knew what to do in rural Mexico if you stop to help someone at the side of the road who's been in an accident, and then you start getting blamed for the accident. Very useful to have a collaborator who knows how to do that, deal with that situation. So anyway, I excavated, and I found lots of artifacts, cool artifacts too. So this is fragments of an egg-shaped pot. This is a reconstruction of it by artist Ajax Moreno, who's amazing at this, but you can see the mouth of the pot there. Here's the mouth, and you can see this elaborate designs on it, and these kinds of interlocking spirals on the design. And this is a close-up of this. There's zones of polishing interspersed with zones of fabric stamping, and it's very fine weave fabric stamping. It seems like cotton that they were already weaving at this time. And this is a wild one that has what looks like a little hand on it, but that's the only one of these that has some kind of representational thing. So not going to show you many objects, but that's one of the cool artifacts. It took me, it just seemed like it was taking so long to do the analyses. We finished excavating in 1997 after I had started at UCLA, and I just kept doing analyses, and they kept going on and on. It took me a long time to actually get all the data sets together to add up how many artifacts we had actually found. And yes, indeed, it's over 1 million artifacts. And I calculated around that time, after I discovered it, indeed, we'd found over 1 million artifacts, and maybe that's part of the reason why it's taking so long. I calculated that if I went to my office here in Haynes Hall at UCLA and spent 8 hours a day there doing nothing but counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, how many weeks do you think it would take to count to 1 million? Turns out 5 weeks to count to 1 million. And that's not even considering that once you get to 397,554, it takes some time to actually say 397,555 and stuff like that. I didn't consider that. So I started telling this story to people, and someone told me, just get students to do it. It goes way faster. A graduate student told me that, incidentally. Precocious, we call that, precocious graduate student. A graduate student from UCSD, actually, not UCLA. And I'll let you decide, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But anyway, 1 million artifacts. It took a long time to do the analyses. It also took a lot of money, so I got more grants and stuff, and I particularly want to thank Marilyn Beaudry-Corbett, who the money she gave to fund the Mesoamerica chair at UCLA really made possible this this research that would never have come to completion. Even with all these grants, there was still lots to do. And I also want to acknowledge some of the many collaborators. Some of these guys were the first ones are authors, also in various chapters of the book. Marty Biskowski analyzed the grinding stones, but sadly died before he could finish the chapter, and Reuven Sinensky came in to finish that up. And Tom Wake has been analyzing the thousands of animal bones we found with 44 different families of animal, just an incredible variety of species of fish and birds and reptiles and amphibians, including this amphibian that looks like it has a head on either side. And the workers thought that if you stepped on it, one of the heads would reach up and bite you, and then 2 steps, you're dead. Which is not true, but that's what they thought. And Henry Flores, who back in 1996 did a catalog of all the grinding stones that turned out to be incredibly useful. And I keep remembering students as if they were then, but he's probably 48 years old now. Henry Flores, if you're watching, thank you so much for that catalog of grinding stones. All these people worked on the stuff, really very grateful to all of them. Okay. So lots of years of analysis and so forth, and then the time comes to apply that model of the emergence of inequality, and we have lack of success. The supposed elite household there with the big, that gigantic building 22 meters long compared to the ones that are 10 meters long and stuff, they all have they rate the same in all these different measures. The elite households, we can't prove that they're serving more food, sponsoring more feasts, more engaged in interregional exchange, or producing more labor-intensive craft goods. They could be, but we can't see it. The only thing that comes out is they are more engaged in ritual and perhaps maintaining sacred knowledge. So a little bit disappointing in terms of applying the model. And it leaves us with a puzzle too, because we have all of this inequality encoded in architecture compared to the artifacts where we're not seeing much inequality. There's platforms at the same time in widely scattered area of the site. This is 200 meters, so this is quite a ways away, approaching a kilometer away. These platforms, nothing though like this in terms of the superposition of one building after another. Excavation continues. So Mike Blake and his graduate student Warren Hill excavate in the other big mound at the site and discover it's not a building, it's actually a Mesoamerican ballcourt, an open area here for play. It's a particularly large ballcourt, and they further discovered when they got the ballcourt that the buildings, the ballcourt and other large buildings are actually oriented in the same or perpendicular ways. So there's a logical orientation to the larger buildings that smaller residences don't follow. And the other project director, John Clark, while Blake was focusing on this structure here in Mound 6, Clark dug very long trenches, sort of 250-meter type trenches towards Mound 7 and others, and discovered that this was a flat area devoid of houses there at the time of the occupation of Mound 6. He proposed it was a plaza. He also had a proposal about the larger scale organization of the site. So there seems to be arrangement of buildings and spaces at a larger scale, and he proposed that we think of this as an early ceremonial center in Mesoamerica, an experiment with ceremonialism that involved a large plaza, but no temple that we can find. So there's these elite residences, and there's a ballcourt here in Mound 7, but there's not a little pyramid with a temple on top or anything like that that's so well known from later Mesoamerica. Another thing that Clark found in his trenches out from Mound 6 was that there was a substantial open, maintained, swept clean and flat area in front of the structure, a kind of patio area in front of the structure. And I found hints of a similar thing in one of the mounds that I excavated from around the same time period. Also another cool artifact. This is fragments. The dark here is fragments of a large statuette, ceramic statuette that's 60 to 77, it was originally 60 to 70 centimeters tall. I don't have a better picture of Ajax Moreno, who's the artist who did a brilliant reconstruction of this, which can be taken apart. So all of the individual pieces can be removed and put back in, and he did this drawing as well, of reconstruction of what this looked like. So a concentration of the broken pieces of this were found in a little midden here behind a 30-meter long platform plowed down at the top, so we don't know about the building that was on the surface of it. But I spent a good deal of time trying to define this platform and understand it. It's similar in height and vaguely similar in size to that platform that Blake had excavated in that big mound, Mound 6. It's just that this had only one episode of construction. It wasn't part of a whole long series of things. They constructed this platform and again maintained this flat open area out front here, so that they had defined a raised area for the platform and the building on top of it, and a well-maintained, clean area here that they didn't dirty up with trash or what have you. And the middens appear here in what I think is the back of this structure. I think this is the front. So there seems to be some degree of formality in the use of this structure, maintaining the platform itself and the differentiation of spaces that it indicates. By the Okos phase, that's within the Lacona phase, 1700 to 1500 BC or so. By the next phase, which is 100 years long here, the Okos phase, I think they are no longer maintaining this as a platform. They're living on a mound. It's eroded by now, and they're chucking trash all over the place. So the dark things indicate midden areas, I guess the red arrows point to it too, where there's concentrations of trash. So the nature of the occupation of this Mound 32 changes from early on construction of the platform and maintaining a differentiated set of spaces and the certain formality in the use to a much more informal occupation in the Okos phase. So I kind of elaborated on that with a bunch of other evidence as well to try to better understand Paso de la Amada in relation to that model of the early Mesoamerican village that we had begun with. So remember, we had begun with the idea that there would be small residences, autonomous, scattered across the site, that they'd each be the location for a residence of a nuclear family. And we had found instead a bunch of large platforms. All these red are large platforms of the Lacona phase, and the blue indicates areas that have habitation but no platform construction. We often in those areas couldn't find that much in terms of the remains of the actual buildings that they were in because they were never preserved by fill. Putting together the patterns at Mound 6, the Blake's excavation, Mound 32, my excavation, we began to envision clusters of residences. Actually, the Mound 32, the platform is here. There's actually a large area behind it that I think corresponds to this. We never got a chance to excavate it. I'm referring to these as multi-family and multi-residence households. So they're very large households composed of, or you can call them lineages or kin groups or whatever. I'm calling them households, composed of multiple families that very often include one large residence that's the focus of activities. We think it might be the residence of the leader of the kin group associated with a lot of formal activities, or a plaza out to the front, looking out to the world, to the rest of the site, an inward focus here, a more informal area that sees lots of deposition and so forth, and smaller residences that are not aligned in any particular way. This one is aligned actually the same orientation as the ballcourt. Quite amazing to discover that only in the analysis after we'd finished the excavation. And then other features around these clusters. So we have residential groups that have multiple houses, but one focus, which is the leader's house. And I envision the leader's house as a place where people were expected to behave, children were admonished to quiet their voices, that there was a certain decorum in life there. The residences of the leader's house would live self-consciously, because I think my interpretation is that they were engaged in ritual to a higher degree than people in other residences, but just by the way they lived their lives, I think that they were conducting ongoing ritual. And so to the question that we debated so long, were these temples or were these residences, in a way you can answer yes to both, although I think fundamentally they were residences, but they had the character of temples, and in another way as well, because I think that the reason that the leaders were not able to amass wealth items and prestige goods or anything is that there was no separation between public and private spaces in these things. The people living, the leader living in these fancy buildings was subject to surveillance by members of the community, especially members of the rest of this household, but probably the rest of the community as well, because they were not in a private home here. They were in a way in a public space, even though it was their house, and that this ability of surveillance on the part of the populace of higher ranking people, I think might be one of the factors in producing that archaeological record that doesn't seem to have any evidence of differences. So things change. It's complicated, but we've been talking about the Locona and Ocos phases, so 1700 to 1400 BC, when the focus of public life was down here in this plaza with the ballcourt and this large building in Mound 6. By the Chairla phase, which is just 100 years before the site is abandoned and never reoccupied, basically, by the Chairla phase, Mound 6 had been abandoned, so this chiefly residence was no longer occupied. Especially by the Chairla phase, already by the Ocos phase, the erosion had started in Mound 7, so Mound 7 no longer appears to be two parallel mounds. It just appears to be one mound, and basically by the Chairla phase that was already well advanced. Instead, they start building a focus of construction over here, and we get for the first time what I think are two public buildings or temples that were not inhabited. We could debate that, but that's what I think. So this is I'm kind of proud of this. It's pretty exotic diagram here. It's real data. It's actual data. So this is frequency standardized by Sherwood weight. So it's frequencies of different things divided by the associated Sherwood weight. And what we have here, the black is tracing ritual objects. These two lines that end up gray are tracing ornaments in general, and then particularly ceramic napkin ring ear spools are traced here. And what we have is we're looking at we have in each case two lines connected by this shading so that you can compare them more directly. The top line is the contexts we think are elite, and the bottom line contexts we think are non-elite. There's problems defining that and what have you, but for the sake of argument, elite and non-elite. And here, and basically the idea here is that the elite contexts have more ritual objects per kilo of sherds than the non-elite, quite a bit more. And in this case, actually, the non-elite have higher number of ornaments than the elite. I think that's sampling error, but that once the elite ornaments rises, then I put a shading in between those. And here, ear spools didn't exist here, they didn't exist here, they suddenly appear, and they're a huge source of differentiation in the Chairla phase. So what this diagram intends to show with real data is that the focus of differentiation between elite and commoner or non-elite households in the Locona phase was ritual. The basis of differentiation was ritual. And that the gap between those contexts gradually narrowed over time, and instead, by the end, the focus of differentiation was personal ornamentation. And if we go to this Chairla phase here and do my original application of this general model of differences in small-scale societies, the emergence of inequality, it kind of works, basically, for the Chairla phase. So it doesn't work here at very early on, but it's not like the model's flawed. The model has been shown to work in other areas, and indeed it does work in this case, but only after a gap of several hundred years between the emergence of significant architectural differences in residences, a gap then until we pick up differences in the artifact records as well of those. And we're almost done here. This is what I've moved to then over the past quarter century that I've been working on this, is getting away from trying to treat Paso de la Amada as a case study in which I was trying to test a model and instead try to narrate the history of the emergence of inequality and ceremonialism at Paso de la Amada. And this set of measures is kind of more data-oriented, although it could be disputed. And this is kind of my interpretations of the history of the site. So doing time here. I'm going to be brief with this. I track various kinds of things over time, and the density of color indicates when that is particularly important during the occupation of the site. These are the 18th century BC, the 17th, 16th, 15th, 14th century BC. So these are each units of 100 years, and those are the phase names up there. And so we're moving from early to late in time as you move across the table, and we're just tracing the focus of public life and differentiation among residences. You can see this, and the different colors here are basically, there's kind of three phases. There's an early phase where they're very focused on building the ballcourt, on these orientations of buildings that match across large distances in the site, so that suggest a large-scale planning. The dispersion of these platforms, these units, each of which have an important leader's house across the site, hundreds of meters apart. And the focus of differential formalism, too, occurs early, and I didn't mention it, it starts to fall off even at Mound 6. So by the Ocos phase, when that elite residence had grown to substantial height and is towering over other mounds at the site with a house on top of it, they were chucking their trash everywhere. They were no longer maintaining well-defined spaces. They weren't inhabiting their residence in this formalized way. I think that we have the beginnings of the appearance of private space, private and public differentiated space at that time. And then ritual, as I just documented, as being a focus of differences. That's early on. Then we have the emergence of hereditary inequality slowly over this time. And by the last period of the site, these, the ornaments as a focus of differentiation, possibly the appearance of temples and so forth. So a major kind of change here compared to what we have here. And then just to kind of draw this to a close, the history that I may tell of Paso de la Amada now would be this episode of the forging of community, where grand designs for construction that involve substantial collective labor that's never again amassed to that degree in the subsequent occupation of the site. This focus on formality and ritual as a source of authority, appearing very on and gradually dying away. Then the emergence of a mature ceremonial center along those lines. Then a crisis. There's reasons for the crisis we're not going to be able to get into here, but I think that a key issue is the difference between authority vested in ritual and formality of conduct to here the gradual appearance of public and private spaces distinguished, and that was a key component for the eventual emergence of rank as embodied in the person of high-ranking people, such that they ornament themselves in a much fancier way than others, and also that they are maintaining prestige items in their homes and discarding more of those things than others. So that's where I've come in kind of 25 years in moving from this attempt to apply a general model to one case to trying to pull apart the complex specific history of this particular site. And so this is the last slide, but I just wanted to apologize that I couldn't bring in my collaboration with all these UCLA people, Tom Wake, Reuven Sinensky, and Kate Bishop, and others on subsistence, but that will have to wait to another occasion. Thank you.